All right, before we get started, and we're going to be in chapter 8 today of Judges, if you want to follow along. Len had asked a question last week about the 400-to-1 ratio that I tossed out last week. Everybody remember that? We're talking about the size of the army, the 300. Israel has got at least 600,000 men according to the Bible, in the surrounding areas. Okay, so now if it were a 400-to-1 ratio, there'd be 240 million Midianites. I don't think that was the case. Okay. Also, if we use the 400-to-1 ratio on the original 32,000 men of Gideon, and that's about 13 million, 12.8. I don't think they marched 13 million people from Midian to Israel to devour the crops. But if we look back, and we're going to get to it today, but I just wanted to clarify it up front. In chapter 8, verse 10, Jack, are you there by any chance?
I can be.
Read verse 10 for us there, and I'll show you where we get the 400-to-1 ratio.
Now Zeba and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men. All that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples, 120,000 swordsmen, had fallen.
Okay, so we're going to get to this in a little more detail during the lesson, but there was 135,000 men, according to the Bible, Midianites in that area. Okay, now it does beg the question, and we're not going to answer this question today, but if there's 135,000, they're defeated by 300, but if there's 135,000 and we've got 600,000 men, and then that could be 1 million, we don't know if that's the right number or not. Why did Israel let this go on? Why didn't they take care of the Midianites before? Anybody got a brilliant answer? Len, I'm looking at you. I'm looking right at you. I don't have an answer for that.
I think God consistently wanted, and particularly go forward to Saul. He consistently wanted them to eliminate people, and they consistently disobeyed it.
Yeah.
And they consistently collaborated with them and consistently intermarried with them.
Yeah, the other thing is, when we talk about the nation of Israel, we tend to think of just one great big united group of people, right? But as we saw last week, with what happened when Ephraim challenged Gideon, remember? Hey, why didn't you call us? Why weren't we allowed to be a part of this victory? I don't know that it was really all one cohesive 600,000. Bart.
I don't know how many years this was after the
take the headphones.
Yeah. After the conquest, but they were, regarding the Midianites, I think they were living on past glories, because if you remember, just before Joshua brought them to Jericho and into the promised land, they had war with Moab and particularly the Midianites, and they slaughtered them all the way south into Edom. So they may have thought, hey, we've got them licked, they're gone.
Yeah, they might have been resting on their laurels there a little bit.
But John, I think also God's use of the 300 was again him trying to get it through their thick skulls.
Oh yeah.
That in fact he was God and there is no other.
Yeah, we're going to get into that a little more, and that's the only thing. That's a great segue. Glenn, you had a comment?
I was going to say, I think the same thing that plagues us today: apathy.
Yeah.
Somebody else will take care of it. I don't have any to get engaged. Somebody else will do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially along political lines and everything else. Jay.
I guess I look at this a little different, but they were an agronomy type. I mean, they grew their own crops and all that, and these people that were coming in, they were just nomad type people, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And it may have been the first year, it was bad, but the next year it was worse. So suddenly the word got out, free food up here in
7 years. That's right.
And then they had to cry out for help.
Yeah, the cycle really doesn't change. It's modified a little bit, as we talked about last week, but the cycle is still the same. They get into trouble, they get oppressed, and then they end up crying out to the Lord. So the only thing you really need to remember is that Gideon's 300 were outmanned by quite a bit. So that's where the 400-to-1 ratio came from last week. So last week we covered how Gideon how God has prepared Gideon for this battle. Now, how did he do that? Yeah, he filtered his 32,000 man army down to 300. That's a great way to prepare for battle. Told him that if he was afraid, you could take your servant with you, which he did. He lets him overhear this dream that one of the guys in camp has. Remember what the dream was? This loaf of barley bread, is going to knock down all the tents, and he gets to hear this. It's great encouragement, because when you're down to 300, he's probably, even though he's exhibiting faith in God, you got to be a little nervous. There's 120,000 and a whole bunch of camels, and he's got 300 men. It had to be a little challenging for him. I think that the dream and the interpretation came at the right time. And Gideon comes up with a great plan. What's his plan? We're gonna do groups of 100, 3 groups of 100. We're gonna take trumpets and torches and pottery. And when I give you the signal, we're gonna go ahead and smash the pottery, blow the trumpets. And that's how we're going to do that. And then he tells them, do what I do. Just follow my lead. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of camp at the beginning of the middle watch. It's about 10 o'clock at night. And when they just posted watch, they blew the trumpets, smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. What happens to the Midianites? It's panic. It's pandemonium. I imagine the camels are probably stampeding out of there. There's probably camel dung everywhere. Okay. What else happens? They start killing each other. They're in such a panic that they actually, they're swinging swords and stuff in the dark, and they're killing their own people. And these guys are just standing there with torches watching this go on. Gigi.
Well, I think about how brave these men were who stood around, thinking, well, I could, I hope this works because I could be dead. But they were brave and stood there because they didn't talk directly to God. They just had to trust Gideon.
They had to trust Gideon. That's exactly right. You got to give Gideon some credit. He is, even with just the 300, he has got them on board. They're going to follow his lead. Was Gideon a man of any kind of stature in the community? No. For all we know, these 300 men may not even know who he was. It's a great plan. First, it negates the size disparity between the armies. The Israelites appear and sound far greater and bigger in size than they actually are. And secondly, it negates the difference in strength. It makes the camels a non-factor, and it increases the confusion in the camp. So it's a great plan that Gideon came up with. You can
really, if you think about Gideon and its history, Gideon wasn't a warrior by any stretch of the imagination.
No,
So this was really God's plan.
absolutely. And where do we find Gideon to start? He's hiding in the wine press, threshing wheat. Okay, yeah, this is not some great warrior. In fact, when God tells him that, he's you talking to me? You talking to me? I'm a great warrior. God made him a great warrior.
So, in what I'm hearing say right now, is you're saying these 300 men, they weren't God-fearing, they were just going to battle.
No, what I'm saying is they may have been great God-fearing men. What I'm saying is I don't know how much they knew about Gideon. I don't think that Gideon, remember early on, Gideon had God prove who he was. So what they knew about Gideon might have been, not that great. Bart.
The Bible always leaves a lot of details out that you just always wonder about. And when I think of this, I think that Gideon had to motivate these men. And I imagine that he gave the St. Crispin's Day speech out of Henry V, where
I was thinking that too.
inspires these guys that God is what a blessing to be among this wonderful band on this day that wins this battle. It must have been an awesome speech.
Yeah, it must have been. And as far as the Midianites go, the last they knew, or it maybe had heard of, was that Gideon had a 32,000 men army. They're not aware that God has filtered it down to 300. So when you come out of a deep sleep and you hear all the noise and confusion going on and you see hundreds of torches all over the place, they're probably thinking, it's a much bigger army than it is, which is why the panic sets in. We talked last week about, have you ever had your alarm system in your home go off in the middle of the night? Yeah, it can be terrifying. I have, Glenn, I have AFib, well, not anymore, but when I get startled awake in the middle of the night, my heart feels out of whack. It's like when grandkids spend the night. Jack.
Do you think it would be safe to assume, since they consolidated all the trumpets from the 32,000 man army, that in the eyes of the Midianites, each trumpet probably represented a cohort of about 100?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And then, I was talking about the alarms. Lindsay reminded me that, they had an alarm about 6 months ago go off in their house. Their kids couldn't sleep for days after that. Their kids had to crawl in bed with them, because they're so afraid. I was talking to Diane last week. You were startled in the middle of the night with alarms going off. The panic that goes through your body is incredible, because at first you're clueless. You have no idea what's going on. Why is the alarm going off? Is it a smoke detector, or is it a break-in? All these other things are going through. You have to process. And if you've been in a deep sleep, you're in a fog. You're in a fog. So it's a good plan. And they called on more troops to help drive them out of the valley of Jezreel. And two of the key Midianite leaders are captured down here by Ephraim. They're all the way down here, Beth Barah. And what happens when Gideon finally meets up with the people of Ephraim? They're a little ticked off at him. Hey, what is this thing you have? And they said, what is this thing you have done to us? They're ticked off because they didn't get the call at first so that they could bask in the glory of that victory that God's provided. What does Gideon do? Gideon puts them at ease. He says, hey, what am I? What is what I've done compared to what you've done? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has given the leaders of Midian, Oreb, and Zebah into your hands. What's he doing? He's blowing smoke up their skirt. That's exactly right. Okay. But he's diffusing the situation, right? Lynn, do you ever have to diffuse a situation on the streets of Chicago?
Actually, right now I'm diffusing the situation in my household.
That's right. You got a bunch of guests at the house. That's right. But he puts them at ease, and it shows incredible restraint by Gideon. And it's probably going to be the last time we see it in action. He's won a great battle, diffused tensions of his own people. Gideon is on a roll at this point. And ironically, it reveals two truths. First, that God was absolutely correct, that he was worried about them boasting. Ephraim gives us that example. God was afraid that if he let them go in with their own might, that they would boast in the victory of themselves. And that's why God pared it down to 300. So you'd have no choice but to understand that it was God that gave them into your hands. Jay.
Well, back to my original thing too, these nomads were coming right past Ephraim, and they didn't do a thing.
They didn't do a thing.
Yeah, they did nothing. Now, they want credit for it, like, hey, why didn't you call us?
Yeah.
Why didn't you do something before?
Yeah, when they were heading north, where were you?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And then second, Ephraim would not have respected Gideon in his leadership. Ephraim's probably the most powerful tribe at this point in time. And you think they're going to follow this kid who was in the wine press hiding? I don't think so. They certainly would have been relying on their own might. And that takes us further into chapter 8, if you're following along. No, a little too soon on that one. Jack, go ahead and read verses 4-9. If you're following with us, we're in chapter 8, verses 4-9.
Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Sukkah, "Give my troops some bread. They're worn out, and I'm still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Sukkah said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? why should we give bread to your troops? Then Gideon replied, just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. From there, he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them, but they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, when I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower.
We're starting to see some of the changes in Gideon here. Okay, first of all, so I can't imagine how tired they must be. The 300 men, they're fighting, they're driving them down south and they're chasing after them. It had to be very tiresome. They fought and pursued the enemy over a very long distance. And then he comes up to Sukkoth to support he wanted some support. And all he wanted was some bread. He didn't ask him to engage in battle, simply to support the front lines. Instead of help, they didn't want to support him until the victory was won. They're asking him, do you have the leaders in your hands? But what does that tell you? They're probably a little fearful themselves. I'm not going to go against this, what I know is a large army, unless you have the leaders in your hands. It reminds me of Ephraim a little bit. Why didn't you call us? Why didn't you tell us? They'll be glad to give you bread once the victory is won. That's what they're telling him. He didn't ask him to fight, just asked him for bread. No trust with Gideon. And yet Gideon, he says, there's no trust in him, but listen to his words. He says, when I come back. Didn't say if I come back. He says, when I come back, this is going to happen. And then in the last line, he says, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. He is confident. Gideon is still very confident the Lord is going to provide the ultimate victory to him. Why do you think they refused the bread, to give them bread? Jay.
I keep answering.
You're downright chatty today, Jay.
I know. They knew how strong these people were. And if Gideon went down there and got defeated, and they found out that they had fed Gideon, they'd come back and take care of it.
Could be.
So they were like between a rock and a hard place.
Mhm.
If Gideon wins, they're in trouble. If the other people win, they're still in trouble. So
maybe they had some lingering fear of the Midianites, for sure. What else? Any other reason?
It's still a trust issue. They didn't trust that God was on Gideon's side.
What about the food side?
Well,
What have the Midianites been doing? Ravaging their land and their harvest. Maybe that was a really scarce commodity to have bread. Maybe they didn't want to share. And the other thing I thought was maybe they're just jerks. Okay, it could be. Yeah, well, I think there's some of that in there anyway. And Gideon knew he was going to win the battle. Like I said, he says, when I win this, I'm going to come back. But then he vows to take revenge on him. You find that little, here's a guy who's following God, you know, and God is providing everything for him. And then they refuse to give him bread. And he's, oh, by the way, when I'm done, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to kick your tails. In fact, he's very specific. I'm going to take your leaders and I'm going to whip them in front of everybody. Does that you find that a little shocking? It reveals that despite God making sure the victory was so miraculous that everyone should see it was given by God, but given by God, not earned by Gideon. Gideon's starting to forget the lesson of the 300. He really is. Len.
John, you know, what's interesting about it is that whenever God calls somebody to do something and then involves other people, he tends to give them credibility, but he tests them along the way. For example, when he told Gideon to destroy the office of Baal, that was a big jump for him. That was huge. And if you remember, the Midianites in particular, but others as well, called for him. They found out that Gideon had done it and they were gonna go after him. They wanted to kill him. And that had to build credibility with his people. And I think one step after another, God built credibility into Gideon. So it's not surprising that Gideon progresses from a coward to a warrior. Not that he was a coward, but he's progressing.
We're in full warrior mode at this point.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and he's probably thinking after these victories that he has had, even though it's been given by God, that he ought to receive a little admiration. You know, how about a little something for me taking care of this for you?
Yeah, he also starts to believe a little bit more in himself, because there's a transition from chapter 7 to 8, where chapter 7, he's relying on God and he's giving all the glory to God. But when he gets into chapter 8, it's more about what he has done.
Hang on to that thought, because we're gonna delve into that in a little more detail in just a second. But instead of, you know, he could have, a godly man might have said to those people, listen, I get it. I understand you have some doubts in me, but this is a victory that's provided by God. God's hand is in all this. This is what he's done. He could have said something like that, but he doesn't. He says, I'm going to show you my power when I get back. That's what he's telling them.
Mine says that when the Lord has given Ziba into
Right.
my hand.
That's
He
right.
did
When?
say that. I mean, he acknowledged when God has done this.
That's right. Yeah. And he immediately tells him, I'm going to beat you up when I get back. Okay. So there's this juxtaposition, and you're going to have to follow along on this as Gideon starts to change a little bit. It doesn't end particularly well for Gideon as an example. Jack, go ahead and read verses 10 to 12.
Now Zeba and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern people. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Noba and Jogbeha and fell upon the unsuspecting army. Zeba and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army.
Routing the entire army. Now, the army's not as big, but it's still Gideon's 300 against roughly 15,000. It's still a great difference in army size. And he continues to continue in boldness in the Lord. He led to this surprise attack. It wasn't the same 300 attacking a vast army, but it's still a big army that he's up against. And this shows the persistence of Gideon. He fought until the battle was won. And then he goes after the leaders of the opposition. Jack, let's read verses 13 to 17.
Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Herez. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him. And the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, here are Zeba and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, do you already have the hands of Zeba and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give you bread to give bread to you your exhausted men? He took the elders of the town and taught them, the men of Succoth, a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town.
So Succoth probably got off easy. My translation says he disciplined them. That's a lot of discipline, being whipped with briars and thorns and everything else. But the men of Peniel, he killed them. This is his own people. He goes into town, he finds a young youth and basically makes him into a snitch. I need to know all the names. You got to give them to me. And they do. So he seizes a member of his own people, discovers the names and elders of the city, reminds them that you taunted me. And then he taught them a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. Yee. Man, that's brutal. But you're starting to see this change in Gideon. And then it was even worse in Peniel, as he killed the men of the town. Jack, let's go ahead and read verses 18 to 19, because this adds a little something to the narrative now.
Then he asked Zeba and Zalmunna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" "Men like you," they answered, "each one with the bearing of a prince." Gideon replied, "Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you."
Well, this adds a big twist here. If we're going to try to look at Gideon's mindset of what's going on, the people he's captured killed his own brothers. Gideon's remarkable pursuit has been motivated by a desire for complete revenge on the people that killed his own family. Think about that. So and I'm not quite sure what to think about that, because first we see Gideon hiding in the winepress, then we see the Lord lift him up, then we see Gideon test the Lord to make sure it really is the Lord he's talking to. And then God builds him up, gives him confidence. You're going to beat these guys with 300 people. And now we find out that he's got some vengeance on his mind because they had killed his brothers, the brothers of his mother. There's no mistake. This is not, Len is my brother in Christ. Okay, but he's not the brother of my mother. Okay, it's very clear who it is here. It makes you wonder how long he had vengeance on his mind. When did that thought of vengeance come into his mind? You think it was there all along? You think it was at the beginning? Do you think it was after the battle? Do you think it was after he captured the leaders? Vengeance is an incredible driver and motivator for people. And you think, Gideon's getting, a little more proud in what he has accomplished? Or did it just sneak up on him after the victory? When do you think that happened, Lynn?
John, there's a fine line between confidence and hubris.
Yes.
And in fact, God had built confidence into Gideon. God had rewarded Gideon with success. But as the confidence grew, I think you've got hubris coming in and arrogance coming in, saying, God is giving me not only this, but I can do X, Y, and Z, and I can do it on my own. And what happened, that's a challenge for all of us. When we've had success.
Yeah, hang on to that thought, because that's exactly where I'm headed, and I'll come back to it on that. But Len's absolutely right. When you have success, even success in the Lord, a lot of times you try to make that your success. Jack, let's read verses 20 to 21, and we're going to get into that in a little more detail.
Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. Zeba and Zalmunna said, "Come do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments off their camels' necks.
For honor of his own family. This is why Gideon asked Jether, his oldest son, to kill them. He wants to humiliate these kings by having a boy kill them, but he couldn't do it. So Gideon ends up doing the execution himself. And Gideon's need for respect and honor and his violent, bitter rage when he fails to be given what he thinks he deserves shows that his success in battle has really been the worst thing for him. He's become addicted to and dependent on his success. Losing credibility all at the same time. And like Len was saying, that's a terrible spiritual danger when you're receiving blessings. Success can easily cause us to forget God's grace. Marilyn.
I'm looking back at a possible correlation between what I'm going to, from my bold position, call Gideon's original cowardice, his hiding, his fear. And that against his arrogance and vengeance. I'm seeing those as opposite sides of the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
Compensating for where he failed.
Well, I think when you have a God-given victory, it can easily confirm a belief that you've earned this. Success can easily lead to us forgetting about God's grace and his goodness. Again, back to what Len was talking about. Imagine a man that works extremely hard in his business, in his job, and he proves himself a financial success. What's the worst thing that can happen to him?
He forgets about God.
Yeah, the obvious answer might be, well, he has career failure. That would be the worst that could happen to him in his mind. Because they're basing their identity on work, and a career failure would be devastating. Did it ever happen to you? It did to me. The further up the company ladder you go and you're growing and you get people that are showing you respect and they're kind of building you up on things, that's really heady stuff. Fortunately, I'm married to a godly woman who would keep me grounded on those things. Well, she would really call me out is what she would do. The worst thing that can happen to a guy in business, a godly man, is career success, because it challenges you. And I've seen it happen. You ever seen this happen in a Christian life? Someone that has, come a long way, and all of a sudden they feel like they've arrived. I've done this myself. Remember years ago, I created a book cover that said humility and how I achieved it. Okay, that's what can happen. That's what can happen to you. Success only confirms the self-belief that I did all this myself. That's one of the things I admire about John Shine at Samtec more than anything, is how grounded he is. The guy is worth more money than anybody in this area, and you would never know it. He's so grounded, so humble, you would never know that goes up, because money's not the driver for him.
So John, the question is, when you're in let's say a business, in any environment, but when you're in a business, or you're coming up the corporate ladder in a business or a hospital, whatever it is, how do you continue to stay grounded? Because that's a real trap.
It is.
And it all of a sudden you're going from being humble and acknowledging God to being arrogant and acknowledging self.
Well, the first thing is you have to have a relationship. I would say you got to have a relationship with Christ, and you have to be in daily. This is what's one of the problems with the people in Israel. Okay, they're worshiping idols. They're not worshiping the Lord. They're not in daily communication with him. And what's the other thing? If you're in business, what's one of the most important things you can do as a Christian to stay on? Stay in the Word. Pray. Give. For me, it was being surrounded by other Christian men. Got to have accountability. I had an accountability partner from a guy who actually worked for me. Can you imagine how difficult that was for him to be my accountability partner? But there was times where he would call me out. He would call me out on something he might see. We would sit down, we'd have lunch together, and he would tell me what was going on. This is a guy who works for me. Now, I could have just as easily said, hey, listen, when we're done this conversation, I'm going to take you out back, get some briars, and we're going to wait. Yeah, you could have done that. That's what Gideon is essentially doing. But you have to have all those things. Otherwise, financial success isn't going to bring true joy.
And John, that's what Kyle was talking about a couple of weeks ago when he talked about the whole issue of submitting yourselves one to another. And,
Yes.
and I think it's important, your first accountability structure is your spouse. And you've got to have the kind of communication where your spouse is free enough to say, hey, I didn't like that. Hey, that's not good.
Yeah.
And Gigi's done that for me. many
Well, Patsy's done that for me at least once or twice. And then the accountability at work. She's not seeing what I'm doing or saying at work, but you have to have that. And I had that in a couple of guys that were close Christian friends and would hold me accountable. We would hold each other accountable on things. It's real easy to get reassured of yourself if you're not careful. And it's easy to forget that we are saved by grace through faith. It's not of yourself. It's a gift of God, not by works so that anyone can boast. We are God's workmanship, created for what? For good works. A lot of people don't finish that. Everybody talks about Ephesians 2:8 and 9. I always like to read to 10 because we were created for good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. If you can read all of that and stay true to that, you're much better off. We need to remember that we're saved by grace when we fail. And we need to remember it even more when we succeed. Jack, let's read verses 22 to 27.
The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son and your grandson, because you have saved us out of the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder."
All right, hang on a second here. This is the last time you're going to hear some sort of godly talk out of Gideon's mouth. I will not rule over you. God will rule over you. Oh, and by the way, could you throw me some gold pieces, for the effort I've put forth? What's he doing? I don't want to be your king, but I'd like to live like one. That's what he's doing. And it says, go ahead and finish 25 to 27, Jack.
It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks.
1,700 shekels is about 50 pounds of gold. Okay, that's a lot of gold. I don't want to be your leader. I don't want to be, your rule. I don't want to rule over you. God rules over you. But could you just give me a little piece of gold, a little piece from each one of you? So he refuses to be their king, but he wants to be honored like one, doesn't he? Yeah, Jack.
I borrowed Bart's calculator while I was reading last night, and that's about 1.25 million.
You talking about today's exchange rate on gold or back then?
Yes.
I don't want to be king, but I want to be treated like one. That's what he's saying. And worse yet is he's taking it away from his own people. Didn't seem like much to ask for, but it does add up when you put it all together. And the people were happy to give this. It's hard to say it's hard to say that he didn't deserve something like that. At the same time, it's inappropriate. It lifted him far above the level of the people that he would lead, and it was at their expense. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like today, doesn't it? It also, when I was reading this, it kind of echoes a little bit to Exodus, doesn't it? When Moses comes down from the mountain and they got the golden calf there and stuff, I couldn't help but think about that story as I'm reading about him, taking a little bit of gold from everybody. Well, how did they make the golden calf in Exodus? They took gold from everybody and fashioned it into there. Now, in the last part, verse 27, Jack, read verse 27 one more time.
Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family.
So what is an ephod? Ephod, ephod, however you want to enunciate it. Well, it's got a couple of different meanings. Okay, one is it's a garment worn by the high priest. Okay, you can see it here. So that's an ephod. You think that's what Gideon made? It says Gideon made it into it. And that's Gideon. He didn't have it made. Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in his city is at Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. So it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So that's one version of what he did. This is another version. And what has he done? He's taken the gold and he's created basically an idol, an image. It was probably placed in the sanctuary in his town. And we already know Israel has no problem worshiping another god. And it's pretty explicit that that's exactly what they did. I was looking at some other references on that. And in Hosea chapter 3, verse 4, it says, in the same way, Israel will live days without a king or leader, without sacrifices or holy stone pillars, and without the holy vest or an idol. It's talking about this kind of thing in Hosea. And I think that's exactly what they're talking about in Judges. He's fashioned the gold. Now think about it. You've got all this gold, you're rich as can be, and now you yourself have fashioned it into some sort of an idol to be placed in the town. And it says it's a snare to him and his family. The people of Israel enjoyed idolatrous worship. They had no problem doing that. Why did they do evil? And, it says they did evil in God's sight because they were worshiping other gods. In contrast to this ephod, in Exodus 20, God commanded his altars be made with unfinished stone so that no one's attention would be focused on the beauty of the stone or the carver's work. See the simplicity of what God is saying? The altar is going to be made out of stone, and I don't want anybody decorating it. I want you carving it. I want you doing anything else. It's one of the things on the temple. Anyone ever been to Israel? We got to go to Israel with Dan and Meg a few years ago, and you look at the wall, the Wailing Wall and everything, those stones, they're like picture frames. Every stone is carved with this magnificent trim around the edge of it. I couldn't help but notice that. And that's the exact opposite of what God said. When you build an altar to me, I don't want it dressed up. I don't want carvers making things so beautiful that you get focused on that. Okay. I think this is an ODG, Len, Arthur Kundal. He died in 69. Does that count as an old dead guy if you died in 69? Old dead guy.
They just have to be under the grave for a few hours.
Okay, good to know. He said, perhaps it's easier to honor God in some courageous action in the limelight of a time of national emergency than it is to honor him consistently in the ordinary, everyday life, which requires a different kind of courage. Isn't that great? He's exactly right. Jack, let's go ahead and read verses 28 to 32.
Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace 40 years.
And one quick thing on that, Bart and I were talking about this before. The book of Judges is not written chronologically. So they're stories. It's a collection of stories. So some of these times of peace might have actually covered multiple judges. Is that right? So when they say 80 years, it doesn't mean that they really had 80 consecutive years. There might have been multiple judges helping create that peace. Go ahead, Jack.
Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine who lived in Shechem also bore him a son who he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abizrites.
No, you're good. It is only at this point that we are told that during Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace for 40 years. But we know by now that it's a compromised peace. It's peace without worship. It's peace without obedience. It's a false peace. And Gideon continues to act more and more like a king. His family arrangements, he's got 70 sons with many wives. You think God wanted that? Probably not. And one concubine. and those of someone aspiring to kingship. That's exactly what he's done. What better way to show your power in your kingship than the fact that you have many wives and many sons? And then he has one son, Abimelech. You know what Abimelech literally means in translation? My father is king. Park that in the back of your mind as when we finish up the lesson today. So he's rejected the kingship out of hand, but he lives it out in reality. So again, he's talking the talk, but he's not walking the walk. How could Gideon refuse to become king because he knows God is king and then act like one? Glenn.
Pride.
Pride, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think the other thing is, I think he knew something intellectually which had not really gripped his heart. Have you ever seen that lived out in a Christian life? What happens? They're on fire. I've seen this, and I've seen this happen in a matter of months, not years or something. I've seen it in months. That people are on fire for the Lord, and then you bump into some sort of roadblock, and then it's all God's fault. Remember where Gideon started? You abandoned us. All I know about God is that you abandoned Israel. So he had an intellectual understanding of who God was, but it really wasn't in his heart. Didn't understand that. There's a huge and growing gap between what he believed about God in his head and the motivations of his heart. Gideon's mistake was a failure to live out what he knew. Again, I've seen it in Christian lives, and it's really heart-wrenching. I'd almost rather see someone who never believed at all than to see someone that is on fire and then all of a sudden they bump into a problem. You know, retirement challenges this kind of thing. I mean, you're in a position of power and control for so many years, and now you retirement and you don't have people coming to you. You don't have people asking you questions all the time. You know, my family thinks I'm an old fart, and what does dad know? And that's a big transition when you were in a position of power for so long, and it's hard to deal with. And it says that Gideon died at a ripe old age. Through his career, we see Gideon as a man who's slipped from great heights of faith. Although, and I find this interesting as we finish up on Gideon, he's mentioned in Hebrews 11. What's Hebrews 11? The Faith Hall of Fame. And Gideon is mentioned in there. I've found that a little hard to believe, but at the same time, I remember a sermon that Bob did at a funeral for a person that took their life. And Bob says, God judges the whole routine, not just the dismount. And I think that's kind of what, when we see in Hebrews that Gideon's mentioned in the Hall of Fame for faith, I think that's what we see in this case. He didn't finish strong, but he provided what God needed at that point. That was to rescue Israel. Jack, let's read verses 33 to 35.
No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord, their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show kindness to the family of Jerubbaal, that is, Gideon, for all the good things he had done for them.
It literally says, then it came about as soon as Gideon died. As soon as he died, they went back to worshiping Baal. Well, I think he gave them some ammo on that as well before he died. Now, I want to do a little prologue here. We got a couple minutes. Mention Abimelech. My father is king. That's actually what his name means. Jack, would you slide over to chapter 9 and read the first 6 verses of chapter 9. We're not going to study Abimelech, but I want you to see the legacy, one of the legacies that Gideon has left behind.
Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and said to them and to all his mother's clan, ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and blood.
No guilt trip there. Mom, okay, can you take care of this? Go ahead, Jack.
When the brothers repeated all this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal Berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless adventurers who became his followers.
He hired yes men is what he did. Go ahead.
He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Then all the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar of Shechem to crown Abimelech king.
It's really a staggering finish to a life, right? Remember, we started off, I think, in lesson 1. You're never more than one generation away from having people walk away from the Lord. We use that Ronald Reagan quote to demonstrate that. He's the son of Jerubbaal, but that's not how it should have gone. There were 69 other people that should have been in line ahead of him, but he took care of that. And the reference to the men of Shechem literally in the Hebrew means the Baals of Shechem. It got translated to men, but it literally says the Baals of Shechem, the word having the original meaning of lord or owner over them. And the relatives of Abimelech, on his mother's side, they gave him a little startup money right out of the temple. They gave him the money right out of the coffers. And he used it. I'm sorry, Tony?
One piece of gold for every brother.
Yeah. From the temple of Baal Berith. He received his pay from the temple. And therefore he killed his brothers. Can you imagine that? I mean, we see this story in the Bible again and again. Cain and Abel. But he killed 69 brothers on one stone. Len.
John, what's interesting here is that we go from Gideon to Abimelech. And I have a couple of questions. Why would Abimelech, other than arrogance, declare himself a king when God even at that point hadn't even approved the kingship, the office of king? So that's first and foremost, and it demonstrates kind of the arrogance that Gideon may have been a bit arrogant, but his son was even more so.
Even more so.
And the second question I have is, why did the Bible go back and forth between calling him Gideon and calling him Jerubbaal?
Jerubbaal.
Yeah, whatever. Anyway, why did they go back and forth calling him Jerubbaal? That's it. Calling him Jerubbaal and calling him Gideon. And one stands for, Jerubbaal is a reminder of what he did to
Let Baal contend with you. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And Gideon is a reminder of the fact that he cut down the opposing forces. And I think it's kind of interesting to take a look at those two. But I don't quite get why Abimelech would have declared himself a king before God had even approved that.
Actually, he didn't declare himself the king. He made the argument, isn't it better to just answer to one person than to 70? And they basically elected him king. He didn't declare himself, but he was certainly making the case. That's what he was going after. And he's also seen Gideon in all parts of his, especially the latter parts of his life. He's seen the worst of Gideon. He didn't see the godly fearing man in the beginning of chapter 6. He saw the worst of him. And a lot of times that's even worse. The old adage, the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. That's what we got going on here for sure. And usually when someone, and it's so sad, I talked to Megan a lot about mental health issues. People that are abused as children, turn out to be even worse abusers as adults, by and large. It's really sad to see that go on. But that's a great question. You know, why does he go back and forth like that? But so what do we learn from all this? First, Gideon, like a lot of people, starts off very strong in his walk with the Lord, even asking for and receiving proof that the Lord is who he says he was. He accomplishes great things in his walk with the Lord and taking 135,000 Midianites with only 300 men. Made me think of, you know who Charles Templeton is? He was Billy Graham's sidekick back in the 40s and 50s. And by all accounts, everybody says that he was even more powerful than Billy was when it came to the gospel. But he didn't finish that way, did he? Anybody remember what happened to him? I think he finished an atheist, but he had saw the cover of a magazine that showed starving children in Africa. And at that point, he says, how can a loving God allow that to happen to kids? And that was it for him. He was done. And Gideon, number two, Gideon shows great humility when confronted with obstacles like the men of Ephraim. But he also quickly feels entitled. He takes the Lord's triumph and he makes it his own. As we talked about, sometimes you need to worry more about your successes than your failures. Usually we learn through failures. We don't always learn through successes. And speaking of grace, it's how we're saved. The gift of God that so no one can boast. And we start off in chapter 6. That's exactly what God was fearful of, is that you're going to, with 32,000 men, you're going to boast about your victory. And Ephraim showed us a glimpse of that when they confronted him. You know, we talked about before, many times we don't see the hand of God at play because we never allow ourselves to be in impossible situations. I'll never forget that lesson that Bart did. It was a number of years ago. And that's, we are so self-reliant, we don't allow God the time to do something miraculous in our lives. Now, I told you this a number of times before, but I don't want you to forget it. In the Greek, the word for prayer, the antonym to the word prayer, the opposite of is self-reliance. And that's where I go on. When you have successes, you tend to start being self-reliant. And lastly, we're never more than one generation away from a family tree that forgets the Lord. Gideon had tremendous triumphs and huge failures. While stating that God was their king, he set himself up a life as a king. His son sees that and sets himself up as king, even though he's not appointed by God. And so ends the successful, wonderful, and tragic tale of Gideon. We're not going to cover Abimelech. If you want to continue reading, it's a long chapter in chapter 9. And the reason we're not going to cover it because he was not an appointed judge. We're covering the judges in this book, and he's not appointed. He's self-appointed. And so we're not going to cover that.